We've been looking then in the past few videos at Blazor, Blazor WebAssembly with everything running in the browser, and we've put together a reasonably functional application to display some book reviews and to summarize them. So if we just take a look at that, we can see that here we've got our list of book reviews, we've got the ability to add a review, and then we've got the summaries page where we have the average rating for each one of our book titles. But what we haven't got yet is any really nice display, so we haven't really applied CSS to this. The one thing we did in terms of display was, you may remember, on this summaries page we displayed it with just the 2 decimal places. But what I wanted to look at this week was some more general styling ideas using CSS, and most of this actually is pretty much standard use of CSS, nothing special to do with Blazor, but there are a few things that are worth just considering. And in fact, the first thing I wanted to look at was the fact that with Blazor, certainly if you use the template that you get when you create a new project, you've already got Bootstrap available for you. So if we just take a look at our application, then we can see that in the www root, we've got Bootstrap there, and we've got a Bootstrap min CSS already put in there. Won't be able to make much sense of that because it's minimized, but we can make use of that. So for example, if I were to go to the book reviews page on this table, if I were to give that a class of table, which if you're familiar with Bootstrap is just a predefined one that we have. We can see it's listing a number of those predefined ones. Let's also, while we're in there, go to this button that we've got here and put on that a class of BTN and BTN secondary. And so now if we run this up and go to the page, you can see we've got some nice styling, really easy to do. So the add review button now has the style that's dictated by those 2 classes, and you can see we've got some pretty neat layout on our actual titles, so it's spaced, and all that is done for us by Bootstrap, exactly the same as you'd expect in any situation. And of course, remember with Bootstrap, although things like those classes like button and button secondary remain the same, we can actually roll our own styles and have a different CSS file, so completely different style without needing to change any of the code, and that applies in Blazor just as much. The next thing we may want to do though is do our own styling. So let's go back in there and let's remove that class table and decide that we want to style our tables for ourselves. And one place we can do that is in the app.css. So we're given this from the template once again that's generated, and it gives us some basic styles, but we could go in here, and in here we can put in any style that we want to apply across the entire of our application. So for example, with my table, if I just wanted to say here table, and then within the table let's have a TD, and then let's have just say padding right, and let's make that 2 REMs say, and then if we run that one up and go back to our table, do a Control F5 because we need to reload the CSS there, but you can see that is now spaced out a little bit more neatly. We don't have that clutter that we had before. And also, because I put it in the app.css, it applies to all tables. And so we can see in the review summaries, we've got the same change of styling because it was in the global CSS. And that's certainly something we'd quite often want to do. But the thing that's a bit different, that's Blazor specific, although other environments like Angular have equivalents, is the idea of CSS isolation. And what that is when we want to write some CSS, but tie it in to an individual component, because if you've got a big application, even though you could break the CSS down into multiple small files and then stitch them back together when the whole thing's finished off, whatever you put into one of those files will apply to every component in your system. And it can get really quite tricky to control because you've got to be very careful with IDs or CSS classes to make sure things only apply to what you want them to. And if you've got a big team of developers working on different components, they can tread on each other's toes. So what we have is this idea of CSS isolation. So what I'm going to do is make a change to the styling specifically on that add review. So we've changed the button, but inside there, this is a separate component, and we can see it's really quite messy. We've been using an unordered list, a UL in there, and it needs some styling to make it look like we want it to. So the first thing I'm going to do is in here, if we look at that add review, we can see that we've got the add review.razor, that's where we've got the HTML. You'll remember from a few videos back, I've got this code behind in a separate file. You don't have to do that. You can have it embedded in the main Razor file, but by calling it the same name, then razor.cs, Visual Studio knows they're linked together. And then similarly, we could do this. We could add a new item, and we'll go for a CSS file. And then what I'm going to call this one is add review, and again .razor.css. So because it's associated with add review.razor, we put that in there, and you can see it again lists that one underneath. Hasn't put anything in there really, but that's what we have. And that will now, by a mechanism we'll see in a moment, be isolated so that it only applies to that add review component. And so what I can do in there, let's change that UL. So we'll make it so the UL has a list style of none, so that'll remove the bullets off the list. Let's give it a bit of a padding, and let's get rid of the margin. And then on each of the list items, let's give that a bit of a margin. And then if we run that one up, and we go into book reviews and click add review, we can see that it's applied some style. We might want to do a bit more on that, but we've got rid of the bullet points. We've got a bit more spacing. It's looking a bit neater. We could do better, but that's got the whole thing working. And the thing about that is, though, that will only apply to what's going on inside that particular component. So if I were, for example, to put in a list somewhere else, so let's just go to our book reviews, and just to show what's happening, put a UL in there, and then put an LI1, and then just a few more, and then run that up again. We'll see that there we've got the 1, 2, 3 still has the bullet point on it, even though in here, and it's within the same page as far as the user's concerned, but it's a different component, and that's what the CSS isolation does, that although we applied it generally to ULs and LIs, it's actually only applied it to what's going on in there. The way that works is actually like this. If we take a look at that, and so there's our UL and our LI, and you can see that what Blazor has done is on each of those put in a unique code that essentially corresponds to this component. So it doesn't really matter what it is, it's just generated to be unique, and therefore each one is identified like that. And then if we look at the CSS, then we can see that where I had simply said UL and done this styling, it said UL and then applied it only to elements that have that attribute with that unique ID. And that's why it doesn't apply to the UL down here, because that's not got that one applied. Notice it's not got anything applied because I didn't bother to put in an isolated CSS file for that component at all. It only does it when you add that addreview.razor.css. So it's not applied on that one, but it is applied on this one. And then because it's put those two together, it will only apply to things with that attribute. And that's a very common mechanism, as I say, used in things like Angular to do this CSS isolation, but that's how it's done in Blazor. You'll notice something a bit less good than you might want it to be is that it ultimately merges all these individual isolated CSS files together into a single CSS file. So we're seeing a reference there back to where this originated, but we don't actually get to see in the browser inspector exactly what we wrote. We see the generated CSS. So that's starting to look okay, but it's still not absolutely perfect. There's still a bit of work we can do in it in terms of getting the layout a bit better. And let's also put, say, a border around that whole add review section just to make it a bit clearer what's going on. And in order to do that, we're going to have to start actually styling things like the inputs and the form itself. And we hit a problem there because if you look at the code, remember what we had with that in the actual HTML is those things were added using these tag helpers. So we had not a HTML form element, but this edit form and then the input text and the input number. So you might think, well, what do we need to put in the CSS? So if we go to our CSS, you might try putting something like input text and then put the styling in there, but that actually won't work at all because, as we said, that input text that we have there is just converted to an input of type text, and there's no similar conversion done in the CSS file. So what we have to do in the CSS is actually put the type of the final output. So we've got to put input in here, and then I want this to apply to both the text and the number, so I don't need to specify the type on there, but I could just do something like margin left and make that 1 rem, and then we'll also put stuff on the form. So we're going to have the form, and I was going to give that, let's say, a margin top, and then also let's do the same on the margin bottom, and then let's give it a border, just a thin black border, and let's give it a width so that it doesn't look too small, so put that in there. So that should give us some nice styling. But if we run that up, we'll see that it hasn't had any effect at all. And the reason is, if we again do an inspect and take a look at, say, the input that we've got there, you'll notice it hasn't been given that little tag that is used as part of the isolation to identify it. So the things that are generated from the tag helpers, so the two inputs and also the form itself, do not pick up that identifier, and therefore the isolation isn't going to work. And so what we have to do to make that work is something slightly different, which is to add :deep in front of that input. And that's something that's not genuine CSS, it's processed by Blazor to get the output that we want. So if we put that on there and run that up, and look in here, then you can see that we've got that extra bit of spacing on the left of both of those inputs. And the reason it's worked, if again we look at the inspector and look at the style we've got on that one, we can see that the generated CSS is slightly different. What it's now saying, any input which is a descendant of that unique attribute. And so if we look here, we can see that our input is in fact a descendant of the li, which has been given that unique attribute. And so having the styling like that, which is what the : deep basically added, rather than what we had previously of input square brackets and all of that, so that's going to work okay. And so that's how it all works when we've got that deep. So let's carry on with that and also put the : deep on the form and run that one up. But unfortunately, we haven't got that form styling. We haven't got a border around that whole thing. And the reason for that is a subtle one. It's because the form itself is not a child of anything. So if we take a look at the HTML again, then we can see that the form is the very top level thing within this component. And so if we inspect that, so go up to the form, its parent is in fact in a different component, and you'll notice that's the wrong identifier. It's not the one that we're looking for. So the trick you've got to do here is, if you want to use this idea of : deep, it has to be a child of something. It can't be at the top level. And it doesn't matter what it is, so it's pretty simple to solve. What we have to do is just put a div around the entire of that form. And now we've got the fact that the form is a child of something. And so now if we run that up, we can see we're getting the border in there and it's all looking nice. And if we now take a look at that, then we can see that it's put in this div and it's given the div that unique attribute. And then the form is a child of that, which means when we look at the styling on the form, again, we get this descendant of something with that attribute. And so that's all working fine. So a couple of tricks to watch out for there. One is that if we're dealing with anything that has used a tag helper, we've got to put in the CSS the element type that's generated, so input for an input number, an input text, that sort of thing, and then also put the : deep. But if the tag helper is at the very top level within our component, we've got to wrap it in something else, just a div worked, so that it is a child of something, so this whole thing will work. Another thing that's worth mentioning related to that is that A lot of people, and myself included, prefer to use, in my case I tend to use Sass, but you might want to use less. So one of these languages layered on top of CSS, which makes it a bit easier to have reusable elements and that sort of thing. Perfectly possible to do that within Blazor, but it's not something that's built in. So you'd need to get hold of some separate tool, and there's lots of them available, nothing really to do with Blazor, but something that will process your Sass or less files and convert them into CSS. But the thing to bear in mind if you do that is they need to run before the actual Blazor build, because Blazor is doing its own processing on the CSS to do what we've seen here for the isolation. So you've got to have generated your CSS from your Sass or less at an earlier stage in the process. But apart from that, it should all work fine. One last thing to look at, just as an example of what you can do, what if we actually want to have an interaction between our styling and our application? Well, various ways we could do it, so let's have a look at that. Let's, for example, conditionally apply some styling to something in our Blazor component. So what I'm going to do here we've got the loop that's displaying those reviews, and let's put in another Razor code block in there. And I'm putting that in so that I can have a declaration of a loop counter. And then what I'm going to do is on the row, I'm going to say style equals, and then again use the Razor syntax, so I can put some C# in here, and I'm going to say I%2 equals 0. So on even rows, that's going to be every other row. And then what I'm going to do is do question mark, and then we'll have a style of background color red or nothing. So what that should do is simply alternate each row with a different color. And then at the end of that, of course, I've got to do an increment, so ++i. And then we should see that if I run it up and go to book reviews, we get each alternate row colored differently. Now, to be honest, if I were doing this for real, I would probably have just done that all in the CSS, because remember you can have a thing like an nth child with even or odd, so it could be done differently, but it just shows the sort of thing we can do programmatically to make this all work. Another thing we can do though is we could do maybe something with a class. So let's do something slightly different here. We're going to say class equals, and then let's call this @table class. And because that's an @ that's implying we're back in C#, and that's going to be a property which we'll now have to add on our component itself. So if we go to the code behind for that one, and then on here I can put on a property of type string called table class, and let's initialize that to normal display. And then I'll just change this in the global CSS, but I could have done it in the isolated one if I wanted to. But let's just on here put a normal display, and then let's give this a border of 3ps solid blue. And so if I now run that up, you can see that we've got that border on there. So the class was read from the component and then just used whatever the CSS for that was for. And then the nice thing about that, of course, is it can change. So what we could actually do here is, remember when we click that add review button, it's changing the state of this show add property. So what we'll actually do is, again back in here, let's on this one change that property so it's going to return based on that show add, and then we'll do alternate display. So that's actually going to switch dynamically, and then let's take that alternate display and back in here let's change that to green. So the details of what we're doing don't really matter very much, it's just showing the mechanism of how it works. So if we run that one up and come in here, and so at the moment it's showing the blue, but if I click add review, then that's changing dynamically to green. So I didn't have to do anything special. It just binds onto that property, and that's what's changed. And then if I fill in title and click add, then it changes back to blue. So pretty simple, the things we can do there. All fairly intuitive, but we've seen that we can just use Bootstrap if we want to. We can use that global CSS if we want things that apply everywhere, or we can use the isolation with the CSS that applies to individual components. I've mentioned that you can use Sass or less as well, and then we've seen some of the programmatic things we can do to make that work. So I hope you enjoyed that. Next time, not sure what we're going to be looking at, maybe some more Blazor. If you've got any suggestions, do let me know. Do click like, do subscribe, and I'll see you for the next video.